Two stalkers meet. Hey, do you know about Vasya, the one who wanted to become a pilot as a child? What's wrong with him? Well, he hit the springboard yesterday. Oops. A person's cherished dream has come true, one might say. He flew. Today, more than 16 years later, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, is one of the best games in its series and the brightest representative of the gaming industry. The GSC Game World company gained its first success thanks to the game Cossacks, but it was the Stalker series that brought it worldwide fame. There were 3 full parts, hundreds of mods, 89 books based on the original story, and all kinds of related merch. All this is the result of the work of a small Kiev company that went to a great deal of trouble to make their dream game. Today, ahead of the long-awaited sequel release, Stalker 2, we will begin to follow the path of GSC Game World, along the path of Marked 1 and other Stalkers of the Exclusion Zone. Let's remember what that path was like, and what does the universe of Stalker look like? You're on the PressX channel. Get comfortable, and let's get started. The history of the Stalker series dates back long before the release of Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, and even before the creation of the GSC Game World studio. As we know, often behind cool game projects, there are talented developers who somehow come up with an interesting idea. Plus, they are lucky to work in a large game development company, and having a sufficient budget, they create a masterpiece. But not all stories are so fabulous and have a happy ending. Stalker is not one of them. The fate of this game is a real dramedy. In 1972, the philosophical science fiction novel by the Strugatsky brothers, Roadside Picnic, appeared on bookstore shelves. The event of the story takes place on Earth in the 1970s in the fictional town of Harmont. Now, you'll hear some complex terms, but it is not necessary to delve into them. You will get the whole point. 6 zones appeared in several places on the globe. Those were areas in which strange phenomena began to occur that violated the known laws of physics. These zones were located along a smooth line on the Earth's surface, a projection of the so-called Pillman Radiant, a point lying on a straight line connecting the Earth and the star Deneb. It quickly became clear that it was very dangerous for people and animals to live in the zones, and the entire population was urgently evacuated. The territories of the zones were fenced off, placed under strict protection, and officially became the subject of careful scientific study. It also quickly became clear that there were many artifacts of unknown purpose in the zones. Some of them were quite useful. For example, they could cure diseases. Some were just strange toys, and some were extremely dangerous. During the course of the book's plot, it was assumed that the zones were created by aliens. There have been many hypotheses that explain in different ways what they are and how aliens need them to contact the inhabitants of the Earth. And one hero of the book, Nobel Prize winner Dr. Valentin Pillman, suggested that all artifacts were dummies, that they were just space debris left by aliens on the planet during an accidental visit to Earth, akin to empty cans and bottles forgotten after a human picnic on the side of the road. Well, actually, hence the title of the book comes from. And the term stalker, according to the authors, became the most popular of the neologisms they created. It was the Strugatsky brothers who introduced it into use in the countries of Eastern Europe. In the context of the book, a stalker is a person who, violating prohibitions, enters the zone and takes out various artifacts, which he then usually sells and thereby earns a living. The book became very popular, especially in the Soviet Union, which was later divided into the countries of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine of those days. And in 1979, based on the Strugatsky script, director Andrei Tarkovsky made a film adaptation of the book and called the film Stalker. After the movie, the term stalker also acquired the meaning of a guide navigating various forbidden and little-known places and territories. However, the film ended up having little in common with the original story, and given the complexities of Tarkovsky's character and the authorities' not very loyal attitude towards the director, the movie was a failure. Although in the director's work, the film is considered no less a classic than Mirror. But let's return to the topic of the video. By the time the book was already actively sold out around the world, on April 18, 1978 in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, the future creator of the Stalker game was born. His name was Serhiy Grigorovich. He was an ordinary boy in the family of a radio engineer and a journalist. He lived in a crowded area of the city in Oblivion with his younger brother Yevgeny, studied at a regular public school, and did not even think about developing games in the future. He just wanted to make good money and first thought about it back in the 5th grade. Then, thanks to a school exchange program, he went to France and was extremely surprised. In France, I saw that, unlike our black and white Kiev of the 80s, there was a beautiful life with McDonald's, Champs Ulysses Pugot. I decided to become rich, but only in Ukraine. Serhiy Grigorovich. Even then, having returned from France, Serhiy brought the game with him, so that later, at the age of 12, he could rent it out to classmates. In this way, he earned his first pocket money. His father later took those savings and bought his son a computer so that Serhiy would not waste his money on all sorts of useless things. Since then, Serhiy kind of became a businessman, and in the 6th grade, he went to the market where he sold computer games and various radio electronic goods. In fact, he created his studio not to make games and be a world-famous game designer, but to earn a lot of money. He knew that in those years, no one was doing this kind of thing in Ukraine, and if you were the first, you could make money. So at 16, no, wait a second, at 16 years old, he created his own company, GSC Game World, the logo of which he had in his head since he was 12 years old. He drew it back in school in 1990, consisting of 3 letters, GSC, which was an abbreviation made up the initials of his own name, written in Latin. Yes, the studio behind the world-famous games Stalker and Cossacks is called Grigorovich Serhiy Konstantinovich, or rather Grigorovich Serhiy Konstantinovich Game World, which literally means the game world of Serhiy Grigorovich. How old were you when you found out about this? Write in the comments. As the developer explained his decision later in an interview, my father said that I should invest my whole life, all my work, in my name, so that later there would be something to be proud of, and I named the company with my initials, Serhiy Grigorovich. Everyone would like to have self-esteem like Serhiy has. GSC Game World occupied a 2-bedroom apartment in an ordinary 9-story building, which was built up in the same type throughout the entire area. Then in the first few years, the company began translating computer games into Ukrainian and Russian and creating multimedia encyclopedias. In Ukraine, the company was the first to do this. Grigorovich personally voiced game characters like Duke Nukem. Years later, Serhiy recalled, "We translated games into Russian, prepared encyclopedias on history, physics, and mathematics. I had profits on oil. I was 16, had a lot of work, and the money kept pouring in." Serhiy Grigorovich. At the same time, in 1995, Serhiy entered the radio engineering faculty of the Igor Sikorsky Kiev Polytechnic Institute. And already during the first winter session, he was faced with the fact that he could not pass it due to excessive busyness with his business. He was made to find himself in a company of programmers, and at the same time look for financing for it and attract funds from translations of other publishers' games. Then he tried to get an economic education and paid $1,000 to enter the private International Scientific and Technical University, but he left it after the first semester. The only useful thing he got out of there was meeting his future wife, Victoria Klugman. The studio started developing its first Quest game only in 1997, and it was still a quest for the company. The team was faced with a lack of experience and technical problems of creating such games, so the development was abandoned. But 2 years later, the studio did develop its first game, which became, drumbeat, Warcraft 2000: Nuclear Epidemic. Serhiy was a big fan of the Warcraft series and repeatedly contacted the Blizzard Entertainment Company to get the rights to develop Warcraft 3. That's the ambition of a guy with a bold voice, but with no success. Blizzard refused to sign a contract, and even more so to transfer the rights to some strange, inexperienced teenager from Ukraine. Furthermore, at that time, Blizzard had already begun their own development of Part 3 of the game and didn't want GSC employees to become part of their company and work on their behalf. But just imagine for a second a parallel reality in which the world-famous Warcraft 3 was released by the GSC studio. But why imagine? Warcraft 2000: Nuclear Epidemic was created by the GSC studio. In simple words, the developers stole the name and graphic component of Warcraft and made demo games using it on their own DMCR engine. They decided to present this demo at the game conference where there was also a Blizzard stand. They invited one of the company's representatives to their stand and showed the development for which they wanted $1 million and the rights to develop Warcraft 3. Well, it is not difficult to imagine what the reaction of a person who took part of his project without his permission could be. Nevertheless, by the end of 1998, GSC created a kind of fanfic remake of Warcraft 2, where aliens intervened in the war between orcs and humans. The game was so ambitious that at its beginning there was even a pre-rendered 3D screensaver. We can endlessly talk about the benefits of the DMCR engine, which was created by the talented and modest programmer Andriy Shpagin, since it was on it that all the strategies of the GSC studio were created, and in the future it would influence the entire genre of RTS in the world. DMCR would open the possibility to create terrain of the game map, but this is a topic for a separate video. Describing the engine work, Sidorovich in an interview in 1998 called control units the main advantage. There may be thousands of them, and this will change everything. No game company in the world has anything like this. Serhiy Sidorovich. Warcraft 2000 Nuclear Epidemic was a non-profit project. The developers had no intention of selling or developing the game, and as a result, they posted the game on the internet for free, thereby attracting more and more attention. And a couple of years later, in 2001, they released the game Cossacks European Wars, which made the studio financially successful. It was Cossacks that gave the studio growth, the opportunity to engage in game development, and allowed the Stalker release. It was innovative in many ways, but today, we are here for something else. So, write in the comments if you want a separate video about the history of the formation and disappearance of the RTS genre. Over the years, the game received a couple of additions, a couple of new parts of the series, including Cossacks 3 in 2016, and American Conquest with a slightly updated engine based on them. Cossacks became one of the most famous and breakthrough RTS in the world, giving GSC fame not only in the post-Soviet space, but also the first worldwide recognition. Even then, developers were faced with the fact that it was quite difficult to look for a publisher for a Ukrainian video game studio outside of post-Soviet countries, because few people knew Ukraine on the global game development market, and they made an ideological decision to develop their own projects about Ukraine, but not without exceptions. And in 2002, the studio also moved into publishing, creating GSC World Publishing. At the same time, the developers did not focus only on strategies, but also made their first tactical first-person shooter, codename Outbreak. The plot was simple. Aliens came to Earth, only this time it was a parasitic form that took control of people and used them for their own purposes. This forced some people to go to war with other people. But besides people, there were other rather unpleasant opponents in the game. Essentially, the game involved fighting an alien invasion on 14 different levels and was a good, moderately hardcore tactical shooter with stealth elements. There were some pretty unusual weapons in the game. Instead of carrying multiple types of guns like in a traditional shooter, the player carried a single weapon with multiple modes: machine gun, laser, shotgun, sniper rifle, or flare gun. The only weapon with infinite ammo was the laser, which was also completely silent to the enemy. It was what you needed for covert operations. However, the missions were different and required different approaches, so which weapon to take was crucial. Armor was also an important choice, as players could choose armor designed for different situations. There was one for the city, one for the desert, and one for the forest. The player had an inventory that contained armor and weapons, as well as ammunition and equipment. Other items such as medical equipment and PDAs could also be found. The character could only store a certain amount of items, but no matter how much cargo the player carried in Outbreak, it did not slow down the character. The player also had a partner whom they could switch to, give him orders, and use his inventory. That is, in fact, the player had two inventories and thus could carry 2 times more items. The game had a rather driving soundtrack which charged for an epic showdown with zombies and space creatures, although it consisted of only 2 compositions, which by the middle of the game began to really irritate and infuriate during the passage. In short, codename Outbreak was not perfect, but it was a pretty thoughtful tactical shooter. It was not particularly popular and was not commercially successful, but it laid some of the foundations for a future GSC hit. After the release of codename Outbreak, the Kiev developers decided to make a more advanced story-based shooter which had to become commercially successful in any possible way. Their idea was based on the concept of the science fiction adventure series Stargate, the first film which was released in 1994. The film explored the theory of extraterrestrial civilizations influencing human civilization and the existence of wormholes that allow travel across the universe. Only instead of an Egyptian twist, the GSC team decided to go with an Aztec architecture twist. The game received the working title Oblivion Lost. Oblivion Lost was supposed to have a living world with mutants who would live their own lives. As inspiration, the developers used games with free, non-linear gameplay. The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall and Morrowind, as well as Half-Life, System Shock, and Deus Ex. We can say that the immersive Sims genre had a very big influence on the future GSC project. By the way, we made a separate video about immersive games and why they are one of the best video game genres, which are almost dead today. You can watch it on our channel or follow the link in the upper right corner of the screen, and we continue. The concept of such a game was too large-scale and energy-intensive for such a small group of people, so S.T.A.L.K.E.R and the team soon began to wonder whether it's worth doing this at all. At the beginning, we developed the game with a plot about the war of robots and aliens in the entourage of nature and the Aztec pyramids, but at every meeting, we said to ourselves, we are doing complete nonsense. Sidorovich. Then the developers decided to move the events to Ukraine, thereby making their work easier and at the same time popularizing the country in the world game development arena. After the success of PressX, the studio did not want to lose face. The original version of Oblivion Lost was abandoned, and years later, some Oblivion Lost builds were leaked onto the internet and completed by skilled fans into something more or less working. You won't be able to play Oblivion Lost, but you can launch and review the project. Sidorovich started developing a new idea. Here, we return to the previously mentioned book by the Strugatsky brothers and the film Stalker. Serhiy decided to transfer the main plot of the book, with swag, the zone, and stalkers, to Ukraine, just so that the conflict was not based on aliens from outer space, but on radiation and an explosion at a nuclear power plant. Considering that no one had ever done this before, everyone liked the idea. The search for artifacts was supposed to take place in Crimea, at Cape Kazantip, in an area centered on the unfinished Crimean nuclear power plant near the town of Sholkino. At the beginning of 2002, the development team planned to visit Crimea to prepare materials, but at the same time, Sidorovich watched a documentary about the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Then, on March 29, 2002, the developers went on an excursion to the Chernobyl exclusion zone to the famous site of the 1986 accident. They wanted to gain their own experience, inspiration, and see what everything really looks like in order to show it more authentically in the game. This was the starting point in the history of Stalker. Having seen everything with their own eyes, the developers finally decided to move the events to the Kiev region, to the zone of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant destroyed by the accident and the abandoned area around it, which for almost 20 years was really the exclusion zone. After that, the developers went to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat more than once to take photos and video materials. The first trip was unsuccessful. The developers were not allowed through at the zone border, but on the second trip, the team received permission to visit. Those excursions turned out to be an important source of inspiration when creating the game, because while walking through the exclusion zone, the game designers felt the gloomy atmosphere of this place and decided to convey it as accurately as possible in the game. A significant part of the game world was supposed to be based on the real exclusion zone, real buildings, and objects captured in the photos during the trip. But at that time, the working title Oblivion Lost had been changed to Stalker Oblivion Lost. At the same time, the name had to be written with dots since the copyright for the name Stalker already belonged to Tarkovsky's film, with which the game had nothing in common. And by writing the name with dots, the developers managed to avoid legal problems. In all other aspects, the project conceptually copied Roadside Picnic. The game area was full of various anomalies, unusual and expensive artifacts, the way to which was familiar to experienced stalkers, and the area was surrounded by military borders. The game promised to become not just a linear shooter. The developers abandoned this idea, but to say a new word in the open-world shooter genre. The young developers had more than enough ambition, and therefore the goals for Stalker Oblivion Lost were unattainably high. Have a full-fledged open world and living NPCs who go on raids against monsters and for artifacts, fight factions, and the player, if desired, can take part in all this. In fact, the game is a large AAA project which was made by a small indie studio. That's exactly what GSC Game World was at that time. Game development entered an active phase. It was based on the updated codename Outbreak engine, X-Ray engine. It produced high-quality graphics and supported many modern technologies such as deferred lighting and shading, allowing for fast and realistic rendering of spaces with multiple light sources and complex geometry. The deferred lighting rendering type has the highest quality lighting and shadows. With this type, there are no restrictions on the number of light sources affecting one object, and all light sources are calculated pixel by pixel, which allows them to work correctly with normal maps. Additionally, all light sources can have shadows and cookie textures. On the other hand, deferred lighting does not have support for image anti-aliasing and cannot handle translucent objects. And furthermore, the new engine made it possible to add a self-developed artificial intelligence system, A-Life. At that moment, in March 2002, a young programmer, Dmitry Yassinev, who was just finishing his studies, joined the team. He wrote his master's thesis on the topic, construction of evaluation functions for deterministic antagonistic two-player games on a board with complete information. Yes, it sounds like something incomprehensible. It is enough to know that he was interested in cybernetics and artificial intelligence. At the time of completing his thesis, Dmytro began looking for a job. Mom helped in the search.
So you've already met my boy?
Yes.
And responded to a vacancy for an artificial intelligence programmer at GSC Game World. Yasenev came for an interview, showed a couple of leading programmers his development playing on repeat, and got the opportunity to talk with the project manager of the GSC Game World company, Anton Bolshakov, who was a good friend of Sergei Sidorovich and actually initially helped with the studio founding. As a result of the interview, Dmytro was offered a probationary period and he agreed, becoming an AI programmer. It was probably at this moment that he received his nickname in the team, Dima AI, but sometimes he was also called Neo. He began the development of artificial intelligence A-Life. Yasenev had no idea how thanklessly difficult the undertaking was. A little later, you will understand why. Thus, on March 27th, the GSC Game World studio officially announced the upcoming release of Stalker Oblivion Lost, which should take place in early 2003. However, already in April, the company announced that the game would be released in the third quarter of 2003. This was the first in a long series of postponements of the release of the future hit. And the reason for this was the production hell into which the GSC team and the game drove themselves. The game was developed by a team of 160 people who worked hard on the engine and drew textures from photo and video materials. However, Sergei Sidorovich did not take an active part in the development, being a project producer. The development manager was Andrei Prokhorov, a former 3D artist at GSC Game World. It turned out that Andrei was born in a family of professional artists and, according to him, began drawing from childhood and did not see himself as anyone other than an artist. By the way, it was thanks to his father that Andrei saw Stalker at the age of 9 in the summer of 1979. Andrei wanted to go to the cinema to see the American film Capricorn 1, but there were no tickets, and his father took his son to see Tarkovsky's film. Years later, Prokhorov thanked his father, who unfortunately is no longer alive, for taking him to watch a film not suitable for children. This is the reason for Stalker, and it is the main one, and this really makes me happy. One could, of course, talk about why the apocalypse is so popular in Ukrainian teams today, and say something like Chernobyl, the collapse of the USSR, the depressive 90s, an unusually strange society born from all this, and, as a result, an unusual mentality and the psychology of a Ukrainian computer game developer. And all of this is partially true, too, but the main thing is the lack of cinema tickets for Capricorn 1 in the summer of '79. Andrei Prokhorov. A little later during his school years, Andrei read the Strugatsky story Roadside Picnic and the film script from the Strugatskys themselves. That one, by the way, turned out to be much more friendly than the final one in the film. So Prokhorov really enjoyed developing a game based on this universe. The new engine for the game, X-Ray Engine, was based on the free physics engine Open Dynamics engine. Its main components are a rigid body dynamic system and a collision detection system, making it well suited for simulating vehicles, legged creatures, and moving objects in variable virtual space environments. It has very high integration stability, so simulation errors should not accidentally throw the system out of control. The X-Ray engine supports rendering up to 1 million polygons per frame, high dynamic range, HDR, rendering, parallax mapping, and normal mapping. It has support for widescreen displays, weather effects, and day-night cycles. In general, the game engine has two main types of rendering, one of which used baked lighting technology, full-screen SSAA anti-aliasing, and is compatible with DirectX 8.1 video cards, and the second uses deferred lighting and shading technology and is compatible with DirectX 9 video cards. Since SSAA anti-aliasing turned out to be incompatible with the technology deferred lighting and shading, the developers have implemented their own form of anti-aliasing, which works on the principle of finding dots on the screen that are potentially ladders and then blurring them. And given that some textures in Stalker are photographic, the special launch key -M blur in the game can enable the motion blur effect. But the main attraction of the X-Ray engine was the game's artificial intelligence, A-Life. The principle of operation of the A-Life simulation system sounded simple in words. There's a non-player character who simply lives his life and behaves as if alive, no matter where he is in the game and no matter what the player does. That is, they exist all the time and not just when the player sees them. According to the developers, this goes against the usual optimizations used in game development. GSC Game World introduced two terms that characterized two character behavior models, differing in the degree of detail: offline and online. The character's offline behavior is very simple in terms of detail. The character does not play animations, sounds, does not actively manage inventory, and so on. Online behavior, in contrast, has a full degree of granularity. Thus, we can consider that offline behavior is the result of online behavior. However, realizing such an ambitious idea turned out to be far from easy. Just imagine, every character within the control of A-Life, regardless of location in relation to the main character, not only exists, but lives to achieve specific goals. Looking for food, fighting enemies for territory, looking for travel companions or those ready to help, resting, and so on. And all these are not the goals of different creatures, but of one creature at different periods of time. This leads to the fact that each character that the player meets along the way is surrounded by a certain context and history, and this context may be different for each player. Yes, unfortunately, you won't be able to talk to many characters. They will say that they are busy or that you need to turn to your elder. The developers were made to do this deliberately due to the difficulties of implementation, and the fact that the characters live their lives, even though they are not talkative, is enough for the players. This approach allows you to create a lot of unusual game situations that haven't been originally written by the GSC scriptwriters. And if in GTA the turn of events can at a random moment create an accident on the road and force the police to chase the offender, then in Stalker the player literally witnesses the migration of mutated wild boars, which stumble upon a group of bandits, and the shootout starts as a result. Everything seems to be the same until the player decides to go in the direction from which the wild boars came running and sees a couple of their killed relatives, and nearby a group of resting stalkers, which leads to a logical chain of events. Let's add to this the names of characters with whom you can interact even after killing them. Nicknames of stalkers, nicknames of bandits, names of scientists and gang members. Only by seeing them, the player's imagination fills in the missing details in the picture. This allows the player to dive much deeper into the gameplay and story, and the game could generate not monotonous events, but entire sequential chains of events. But still, there were problems with the life simulation system. The developers had to dig deep into system resources to ensure the game ran smoothly. This meant limiting the number of NPCs and creatures that could be active at any given time, cutting back on the open world, and cutting back on NPC functionality. We'll talk about this in a little more detail later. For now, we can only say that the main task of the game designers was to balance the A-Life system so that it would still be complex, not empty in functionality, and would not disappoint the players. The development team had to fine-tune the parameters of NPC behavior and the frequency of events in the game world. Soon, the official website of the game, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Oblivion Lost, was released, and NVIDIA became the studio's technical partner. Thanks to this, the developers promised to include support for shader capabilities of the then new line of GeForce FX graphics processors in the game. In November 2002, the first gaming build appeared, which showed the image quality and operation of the new engine using the example of driving a game vehicle. In this demo, you could already feel the mood of the upcoming game. By the beginning of 2003, several well-known game publishers wanted to release the upcoming Stalker Oblivion Lost, including Activision, Ubisoft, Codemasters, Vivendi, Eidos. Of course, the game could have been released on its own through GSC World Publishing, but then it would have had significantly less fame abroad and would have hardly become so popular. As a result, Sidorovich choice fell on the American company THQ, with which GSC signed a contract to publish the game throughout the world, with the exception of the post-Soviet space, where the game was to be published by another company. THQ allocated money for development and sent its producer Dean Sharp to Ukraine to control the process and monitor finances. A demo of Stalker Oblivion Lost was shown at the Game Developers Conference in March 2003 at the NVIDIA booth. Journalists were very positive about the game, especially its graphics engine, which could generate more than 2 million polygons per frame. And in May 2003, the project was demonstrated at the E3 Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles, and soon after that, the game's release date moved again. Now the game has been postponed to the second quarter of 2004 for almost a year. Difficulties appeared from the very beginning with the A-Life system, a world living according to simple and understandable laws. Despite the fact that this had already been implemented in other games, the concept was invented anew. Leading game designer Oleksiy Sichonov really liked the idea of the simulation, which appeared according to the requirements for the game that he put forward. Other programmers were against the simulation. They were not happy that spawning became unpredictable. After a month of debate, the developers defended their idea and added support for dynamic spawning in the engine, which gave rise to a life simulation. On March 1, 2003, the simulation was launched for the first time at the level. At the same time, the young author of the idea, Dmitry Yasenev, was promoted to senior AI programmer. In an interview, development manager Andrei Prokhorov recalled, "Thanks to Dmitry Yasenev, the smartest of smartest people. Thank you for not listening to the friendly roar of well-wishers. It is impossible to create a life simulation in a shooter. Unprecedented hard work. Talent and unwillingness to take the easy way." Andrei Prokhorov. By 2004, the game was almost ready. Most of the locations were ready and assembled into a single world. Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Dead City, garbage roast stock plant, radar, and generators. Simulated changes in time of day with dynamic weather and the A-Life simulation system. The weapons were calibrated, the items' physics worked correctly, and everything seemed to be fine. Even the game title, at the publisher's request, was changed to something more familiar and understandable to users. The name Oblivion Lost was finally abandoned, and the game was called Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. But the developers again did not have time to release the game on time, and they wouldn't have time for another 3 years. In connection with the transition to a new render, there were some difficulties. The same production hell in which developers found themselves. Initially, the game was focused on DirectX 8, but subsequently it was modified many times to fit its time. And while the game's release date was being pushed back, DirectX 8 was changed to DirectX 9 to keep the game fresh at the time of release. There were two versions of DirectX 9, with dynamic or static lighting, implemented using deferred shading technology such as Light Map. Thus, at the time of the release of Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, the user could select the version of the graphics API in the game's graphics options. However, at the time of creation, errors multiplied one after another. When they corrected the first one, the second one appeared. The main problems revolved around the life simulation system. THQ again announced that the game would be postponed until next year. By September 2004, the game's main advantage had become its own downfall. Playtests began, and the team was in for an unpleasant surprise. Tests showed that life simulation was unpredictable. On the one hand, GSCs gained an amazing sense of the living world. On the other hand, they realized that a game that was completely controlled by a life simulation without a story sequence of events was unpredictable and uncontrollable from a game design point of view. There were either too many events at once, or nothing could happen for a long time. Situations often happened when it was not clear where the player should go and what to do next. However, this was a playable build, the closest to the free play concept. Then the developers realized the need to refine the game and began to shape the plot. In February 2005, GSC changed the release date to an indefinite period, saying that they would release the game when it's done. At the same time, the user fan base, which had been waiting for several years for the largest domestic game in the post-Soviet space, all this time was drooling over screenshots, interviews with developers, which is why the people called the game Stalker, meaning the one who waits for a long time. Perhaps the game would have taken even longer to make it if it weren't for THQ, which urged the developers and hinted to them that it was time to release the game. The developers were completely immersed in refining the A-Life system, which was too independent and uncontrolled. Moreover, changes were made to the geometry of the levels, and several locations were completely redesigned. The plot was finally completed in May. By the end of the year, the game was almost ready, but the number of errors made the studio postpone the release one more time. Then there was a split in the studio. At the beginning of 2006, some key employees left the studio, including development director Andrei Prokhorov. He, along with other people from GSC Game World, founded his own studio, 4A Games, and later they began developing their own Stalker with Blackjack and Apocalypse. That is a dystopian first-person shooter, Metro 2033. The remaining GSC development team began optimization and beta testing of Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. They carefully refined the game and checked for all sorts of bugs and various errors. According to the game's producer, Dean Sharp, it was the studio's inexperience with such a large project and huge ambitions that became the reason for all the production hell that the game went through during 6 years of development. Game designers added too many mechanics that they could not implement. At one point, he even promised to stop funding if the GSC did not make concrete conclusions. Fortunately, the game was brought to its final form. Shortly before release, the game was leaked onto the internet. Having been published on one of the file trackers, it quickly spread across the internet, and many were able to play just a few days before the release date, which was March 23rd. THQ and GSC Game World actively tried to plug the leak, but they had no choice but to officially release the game 3 days earlier on March 20th, 2007. Finally, after 7 years of development, millions of users and fans around the world could enjoy the brainchild of GSC. More precisely, those who were able to launch the game, since the game had many problems from the start of sales. More on this later. In the meantime, let's finally find out what plot content the game developers came up with to pacify the life simulation system. In the case of Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, the most interesting thing in the game is, of course, the plot. It started out quite simply. According to the PR manager of GSC Game World, when we started the development, we wanted to create a what-if scenario based on the real and very terrible events of 1986, when the fourth power unit in Chernobyl exploded. Yuri Besarab. So let's plunge into this mysterious, frightening, and intoxicating like cotton candy radioactive world. Take your Geiger counter and get ready to fall into the anomaly.
What?
The events of the Stalker universe take place in an alternative reality to ours, where the Chernobyl nuclear power plant also exploded due to an accident in 1986, but where after that something even stranger and more terrible happened. And before getting acquainted with the main events of the game, it would be logical to start with the background. Even before the accident at the nuclear power plant, in the small secret city of Limansk, experiments were conducted on mental control of the population using radio waves. Near the city, there was an over-the-horizon radar station that monitored airspace over long distances for the purpose of early detection of enemy missiles. The station did not have a very good effect on the psyche of local residents. Because of its radiation, locals had difficulty making contact with strangers and fanatically praised Soviet power. Well, yes, the station was not built by the Soviets. In short, don't look for logic in this. At the same time, residents of surrounding villages complained of severe headaches. Well, fortunately, after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986, the complaints stopped. No one carried out an evacuation in this area, and soon Limansk and its surroundings were deserted and everyone forgot about the city. Experiments by scientists in Limansk discovered psi radiation, and after the accident, another group of scientists began studying it. And once inside the literally extinct exclusion zone, the scientists were left to their own devices and no one could stop them. There were no unnecessary witnesses, no people wandering around, and there was a powerful source of energy nearby in the form of a still operating nuclear power plant. Studying psi radiation in these, so to speak, greenhouse conditions, scientists organized a whole complex of secret laboratories with the X index. Who knows, maybe our channel is one of them. If we expose anyone, it is only with high-quality content. If you want to know everything about games, the history of their creation, and who is behind it, subscribe to the channel and press the bell button. This way you will always be aware of new videos and be the first to watch them. X laboratories were part of a set of classified projects under the single name Project X. The tasks of the laboratories included genetic experiments, the development of new types of weapons, and establishing contact with the information shell of the Earth, the noosphere. Wow! With the help of psi radiation, scientists wanted to connect to the noosphere. So this is what Elon Musk wants to bring to the planet with his Starlink. According to the hypothesis, the noosphere contains many layers: awareness of one's own self, judgment based on a concept, thinking about feelings and sensations, opinion based on knowledge and faith, philosophy about science and religion, and in the end, social awareness. It is in the noosphere that all mental images of all living beings on the planet are stored. Scientists wanted to make some changes to the noosphere that would rid people of all the negative mental images and vices that, in their opinion, push humanity to commit crimes. The ultimate goal was to change the world, to make it ideal. But as a first experiment, it was decided to simply connect to the noosphere and see if it could be influenced. The main headquarters of the scientists was the X8 laboratory, which was located in Pripyat under the Yubiliny Public Service House. There, scientists coordinated their actions and experiments. At the same time, under an abandoned mechanical engineering factory in a dark alley, there was the X18 laboratory, and it was in that the experimental subjects were irradiated with psi radiation, causing terrible mutations. Of course, noble scientists first experimented on rats, and even then witnessed the harmful effects of radiation on the brain functioning, but they soon began experiments on humans.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Scientists wanted to develop telepathy in experimental subjects, the ability to transmit thoughts at a distance. The results were unsuccessful. People were tormented by auditory and visual hallucinations, and sometimes psi radiation completely destroyed their nervous system. The results of these studies were transferred to the X-16 laboratory for additional study. There, scientists finally went beyond ethics and began experimenting with human genes. During their experiments, new species of creatures were born. They were far from the most pleasant-looking species. Poltergeists, Burrs, controllers, and probably pseudo-giants were also bred there. All of them were victims of experiments in the Universal Soldier program. There were experiments to create an army with extraordinary abilities, which were inadvertently sponsored by the Soviet government. Psi radiation was produced during the mental activity of living beings, in particular humans. That is why experiments within the framework of the Universal Soldier experimental program were carried out on people. At the moment of irradiation with psi radiation, the experimental subjects received a dose of numerous mental images of surrounding creatures, which is why the experimental subjects simply went crazy. Scientists created a powerful psi radiation generator to subjugate the noosphere. Behind this was a certain Professor Kaiminov, who later created the Rainbow Aggression Suppressor, popularly called the Brain Scorcher. Yes, they called it whatever they called it. Scorcher, sometimes Brain Scorcher, Brain Crusher, Brain Washer. Well, you get the idea. At first, in its place, there was an ordinary station for detecting intercontinental ballistic missiles, but later a group of scientists called C Consciousness, Common Consciousness, transformed the station into a psychotronic weapon. As a result, the C Consciousness group would be to blame for the second accident that occurred, but more on that later. The control bunker of the radar station was converted into the X-10 laboratory and was located in the Red Forest. As a result of the Chernobyl accident, tens of thousands of hectares of forest experienced powerful radioactive contamination with a total length of about 2 kilometers to the west of the plant. The tree needles, affected by radiation, became orange like rust, and that was how the Red Forest appeared. That area was called Radar, a gloomy place almost in the very center of the zone. Most of the area was occupied by dead forest, and the path to the center was blocked by the Brain Scorcher. The radar territory was controlled by a group of armed religious fanatics called Monolith. It's interesting that initially in the story of late 2004, early 2005, the scientist's last name was Kasyanov. He was the head of the X-18 laboratory and, in secret from the Ukrainian government, received consumables and equipment for his activities from the Agroprom Research Institute. But that idea was abandoned. As a result of the creation of an aggression suppressor, Kaimanov's developments were subsequently used to create a certain installation in the X-16 laboratory, which was also called Monolith.
What the f*** is this?
Hard to tell. Apparently, the psi radiation generator imitated human mental activity, only it did it much more intensely, creating a powerful psi field around the former station. The parts for it were made at a mechanical engineering factory in the Dark Valley, where the X-18 laboratory was located, and the assembly was carried out in the valley of the dried-up Lake Yantar. Under the buildings of an abandoned plant in the X-16 laboratory, the old plant on Yantar had a bad reputation among stalkers. Few people returned from there, since there was an experimental Kaimanov psi emitter, a prototype of the Rainbow Aggression Suppressor. Also in X-16, during experiments on people mutated into controllers, scientists developed the Kaimanov biological emitter, which was essentially a giant brain capable of intense mental activity and control of people and animals.
What do you heads do all day?
We share our wisdom with those who seek it.
However, scientists were unable to teach the brain to give people the necessary commands, and instead the installation zombified the creatures, collecting them around itself. How did those scientists manage to avoid being affected by the installation themselves? Wearing tinfoil hats? Meanwhile, things were better with Rainbow. Scientists tested the operation of the installation. Rainbow sent a signal to a ship in the Caribbean Sea, but the scientists on board received the signal with distortion, as if the recording was influenced by the noosphere. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and all secret experiments became that way forever. The new Ukrainian government knew nothing about them, and the secrets of the Chernobyl exclusion zone disappeared into oblivion. Fearing criminal liability, scientists were afraid to cooperate with the new government and were left without funding. However, not for long, soon they would be able to find an interested investor and funding would resume. The Ukrainian government gained control over only one object in the exclusion zone, namely the Agroprom Research Institute. There, other scientists were already studying the possibility of farming on radioactive soil. And if at first it seemed that everything was going to work out, it soon became clear that the head of the Agripom Research Institute, Doctor of Agricultural Sciences Piotr Danilovich-Streiss, was not engaged in its research activities, but entered into collaboration with the head of the X-18 laboratory. The Ministry of Agriculture financed the activities of Agripom, and Streiss supplied state funds and equipment to the illegal scientific and experimental activities of X-18 under the leadership of Vadim Mikhailovich Chopko. Peter was inspired by the results of the scientists' work in laboratories and wanted to join their group, C Consciousness. As a result, by 2006, C Consciousness scientists had proven a two-way connection between all living organisms on the planet and the noosphere. Not far from the nuclear power plant, they built generators to connect to the noosphere. The generators were controlled from the underground bunker of the X7 laboratory. From the main research laboratory X8, a group of scientists represented by Lebedev, Kalansha, and Soslov transferred to X7, where the problems of the influence of the noosphere were studied. As it turned out, the human brain turned out to be insufficiently suitable for connection, and all experimental subjects turned into zombies. Then, 8 members of the C Consciousness group decided, as they say, not in word but in deed, to become a single consciousness. They united into an interconnected network of collective intelligence. To do this, they climbed into autoclaves and together established a connection with the noosphere. It was a breakthrough, but it turned out that it happened in the wrong place. On April 12, 2006, in Call of Pripyat, the date changed to June 10th, at 14:33, the experiment went out of control. There was a break in communication, and the energy of the noosphere poured onto the Earth, changing everything around. From the outside, it looked like a stream of bright light, evaporating the clouds and raising already buried nuclear fuel into the air, followed by thunder and an earthquake. Most of the military personnel guarding the perimeter of the still normal Chernobyl exclusion zone and other people located on its territory died instantly, and it was not possible to organize rescue operations for those few who survived. In just a day, government troops completely cordoned off the territory of the new zone and began sending the first reconnaissance expeditions inside to find out what happened. Expeditions inevitably ended in failure. After some time, for unknown reasons, the diameter of the zone began to grow. Most of the military personnel on the borders, as well as employees of field scientific laboratories located near the perimeter, died. It's scary to imagine what happened in the Secret X laboratories. The experimental subjects either died instantly or broke free and underwent terrible mutations. Despite this, the scientists of C Consciousness survived, and the energy of the noosphere began the formation of a new order in the zone. Anomalies unexplained by science formed everywhere. During this time, the size of the zone increased by several kilometers. After this, the government decided to evacuate the population of nearby villages and towns. Objects began to form in the anomalies, which C Consciousness began to study and later gave them the name artifacts. The properties of the artifacts were established, and most of them found some use in everyday life. Later, scientists learned to control the energy flows coming from the noosphere, but due to its size, they had to release excess energy from time to time, which led to these so-called emissions, a deadly flow of energy vaguely similar to a hurricane and thunder. After the emissions, the zone expanded slightly, and some anomalies were replaced by new ones. Some people in the zone were able to sense the approaching emission and recommended looking for some kind of shelter from it. The C Consciousness group decided to temporarily limit the civilized public from information about what happened while they searched for a solution to the problem. To maintain secrecy and prevent information leakage, the brain scorcher was activated, which zombified anyone who tried to approach the center of the zone. Thus, the direct path to it was closed. But this was not the only protective measure. Inside the sarcophagus of the 4th Power Unit, where the accident occurred in 1986, there was an illusory crystal. The Stalkers called it the Shard of the Monolith, or Wish Granter. According to legend, if you manage to complete Rainbow Aggression Suppressor and get to him, it will fulfill your every wish. Does anyone know if this is true? Well, the last level of protection created by C Consciousness was the Stalker program. Stationary, tactical, personality, annihilator of Professor Klymanov's capacitive discharge. It sounds confusing, but the principle of the program is quite simple. Soon you'll understand everything. You have just completed the brief course to join the ranks of the Stalkers, and we are done with the background. From this moment, the game begins. Our character rushes on the death truck through the beautiful wastelands of the zone, but a sudden anomaly strikes the truck like lightning, thereby confirming its not accidental name. Well, as often happens, looters always appear at the right moment, and the morning after the thunderstorm, this redhead is right there.
This one seems to be alive. What a lucky guy.
In short, our character turns out to have survived the shock dose of electricity, and he doesn't remember a thing, even how to walk. Therefore, the redhead drags him on his back to the local merchant, Sidorovich, in the hope of earning a little extra money. Sidorovich immediately shows his hospitality. He does not want to hear about some kind of mark or about the PDA found in the survivor, but upon hearing that he is alive, he abruptly changes his mind. The character's tag reads Stalker, and the PDA only has one entry: kill the gunslinger. Sidorovich is ready to pay for the PDA, but the main character does not throw away his things. He snatches his PDA from him and passes out. At this point, the pre-rendered video ends, and when the character wakes up, the player can begin gameplay. It's worth noting that the direction in this video is simply beautiful, especially for 2007, and in general, all the screensavers of Shadow of Chernobyl, which can be assembled into a full-fledged film. Death trucks are trucks nicknamed by stalkers, periodically traveling somewhere, probably from the center of the zone, and besides for the main character, according to Sidorovich, no one has ever been found alive in them. Well, the player supposedly must work for Sidorovich for his salvation. Sidorovich believes that it was he who saved the character and gives him the nickname Marked One because of the strange tattoo on his arm.
And I'll see what I can find out about your problem. I don't give a shit why you want to find this S.T.A.L.K.E.R guy. I mind my own business. If you want to kill him, well...
Sidorovich promises to look for Gunslinger, but in the meantime, he asks Marked One to find a stalker nicknamed Nimble. He carried a flash drive with important information to Sidorovich and disappeared somewhere near the railway bridge. To help the player, he has a PDA, which serves as both a map and a log of tasks and statistics. After talking with the stalker Wolf, the commander of the local newcomer camp, Marked One learns that Nimble is being held captive by bandits at the ATP. By the way, here in the camp in the house attic, you can find a cache of provisions, of which there are a whole lot scattered throughout the zone. We recommend that you don't be shy about breaking boxes. Food or some goodies often fall out of them, anomalies, and sometimes weapons. Of course, I'd like to talk about side quests, but then this video will stretch for another hour because this will be the main plot of the game. Having killed all the bandits and freed Nimble from captivity, the main character takes the flash drive from him and returns to Sidorovich. And as a reward, the seller shares the information he found about Gunslinger.
Anyway, here's the thing about S.T.A.L.K.E.R. There's a stalker that goes by this name. And they say he's found a path to the northern reaches of the zone. That is a virgin area, a real gold mine for artifacts. Yeah. Anyway, I can help you find him. However, as you can imagine, it won't be a free ride. You'll have to work it off. But in the long run, we'll both benefit. You're going to waste that S.T.A.L.K.E.R fella and find out what happened to you, and I'll find... I'll get my share of our mutual profit.
Sidorovich offers help in finding Gunslinger. In exchange for this, Marked One must steal documents clearly related to the center of the zone, which the military discovered in the building of the former complex of the Agroprom Research Institute. Sidorovich and other traders need passage to the center of the zone in order to find the legendary Klondike of artifacts. It is impossible to penetrate into the center of the zone. The passage is tightly blocked by the Scorcher. Marked One agrees and crosses the railway embankment, strewn with anomalies and guarded by the military. After this, Sidorovich contacts him via radio and says that a stalker nicknamed Fox, who returned from a deep raid, is wounded and is nearby. According to Sidorovich, Fox may know information about Gunslinger.
We got the tail, but we missed the fox.
Mark 1 saves Fox and sends the player to his brother Seri, who is in a hangar at the garbage. There, the Stalkers need help with the bandits, and after Mark 1 helps fight them off, Seri shares information. According to him, the road leads to Digger, nicknamed Mole, who unearthed the cache of Gunslinger's group. Mole is at the Agroprom plant, and the main character saves another hard worker, only this time from the military who are trying to seize the plant. It's worth saying here that given the time context, the military in the game has a peculiar coloration. After the 1986 accident, the exclusion zone was mothballed in the form in which it was in the Soviet Union, and for this reason, ruples and the trading currency here. It is impossible not to take into account the market that the game was aimed at when it was released. But even in Ukraine at the beginning of the 2000s, this name of the currency still appeared in colloquial speech, and the attitude toward the military was far from the same as it is today. Who in 2007 thought of the army and military structures as something good and necessary? War in Ukraine? What are you talking about? Not with Russia? Well, you understand. And therefore, judging by the conversations of the military in the game and the Stalkers in relation to them, it seems that these are some dubious and corrupt guys who do their work carelessly and are not shy about making money from ordinary Stalkers. The Mole shows Mark 1 the location of the hiding place. It is located in the Agropom dungeon. Mark 1, fighting off the military and mutants, finds a cache that contains a flash drive used by Gunslinger's group as a means of correspondence. Why haven't you, children of instant messengers and Instagram, heard of this? To be honest, me too. From the correspondence on the flash drive, Mark 1 finds out Gunslinger's group also included Ghost and Fang. There is also information about a mutual friend who provided significant assistance to their group. According to the Ghost's message, Fang died and Gunslinger went alone to the center of the zone. At the exit from the dungeon, Mark 1 discovers that he immediately ends up in a military base and, by chance, steals the documents Sidorovich needs. Sidorovich advises immediately taking the documents to the barkeep, who runs the affairs of the Stalker bar 100 Rads, located on the territory of the former Rostock plant. They plan to add the factory location to the game, and it was even included in some early builds, but it was not included in the final game version. There, the barkeep reports that these are not all the documents. The papers mention some kind of laboratory under the symbol X18, which by description resembles the underground premises of the Dark Valley, where the missing part of the documents is located. To open the laboratory doors, Mark 1 needs 2 electronic keys, and the first one is given to him by the barkeep. The second ends up in the Dark Valley in the hands of the leader of the bandits, nicknamed Hog. Next, the player remains to act according to the established scheme. Infiltrate the bandits' base, kill Hog, and take the second key from him. In the valley, Mark 1 meets a fighter from the paramilitary group Duty, which essentially protects humanity from the zone and sets the goal of complete zone destruction. A man named Bullet interrogates a bandit about his captured brother-in-law. The bandit says that he will be taken to the old factory, and then Mark 1 has to help Bullet free his comrade. At this moment, Mark 1 eliminates all the bandits, including Hog. Having entered the laboratory, Mark 1 saves Bullet, finds the remaining documents, and suddenly loses consciousness. What brilliant cutscene direction. The character has a dream in which he sees memories of his first trip to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, how he fought off a pack of rats. This memory already makes the player think that Mark 1 is not an ordinary stalker, but someone who has experienced some interesting story. The dream ends at the most interesting point when Mark 1 hears Gunslinger. He comes to his senses. At this moment, Sidorovich reports that the bandit's base has been attacked by the military and the passages to the garbage have been blocked, but he can use the old road to Cordon. Using it, Mark 1 takes the documents to the barkeep. Having studied the documents, the barkeep talks about the man-made nature of the brain scorcher, about the scientist's tricks in the X18 laboratory, and understands that these are again not all the documents, and gives a tip to the missing part located in the X16 laboratory near the lake and the plant Yantar. On the way there, in the wild territory, Mark 1 sees how mercenaries shoot down a helicopter of environmental scientists. Mercenaries are hunting for information located on Professor Kruglov's flash drive. Mark 1 decides to help the surviving Professor Kruglov escape from the mercenaries, and together, the characters go to the mobile laboratory of ecologists. In the end, Kruglov informs Mark 1 that the flash drive is just a copy of the research results and gives the flash drive to him. A barkeep can pay a good price for a flash drive, but the information on it about psi radiation is valuable. It turns out that psi radiation affects only the higher areas of thinking only in humans and highly organized animals, such as dogs or horses, but only the person was completely exposed to the trance effect. According to scientists' calculations, the source of radiation is located in the center of Lake Yantar and it can probably be eliminated. Meanwhile, in the ecologist's bunker on Yantar, the head of the ecologists, Professor Sakharov, tells Mark I about the location of the X-16 laboratory and the method of protection against psi radiation.
Their skin changes colors. That's why we couldn't see him that night.
To protect against waves using a special psi helmet, scientists need measurements of psi radiation. Fighting off mutants and zombies, Marked Man leads Professor Kruglov to the place of measurements. The heroes miraculously manage to survive and return to the ecologist's library since a burst occurred during the measurements. A sharp surge in radioactive, anomalous, and psionic activity again leads the Marked I to loss of consciousness. This time, while passing out, he hears a dialogue between Fang and Ghost, two members from Gunslinger's group. At this time, Professor Kruglov manages to drag Marked I onto the bus from being thrown out. Kruglov is caught in the blast, but somehow he survives. Returning to the laboratory, Kruglov gives the measurement results to Sakharov and he uses them to set up a psi helmet, which he gives to Marked I. Having received protection from psi radiation, Marked decides to get into the X-16 laboratory, but the scientist Vasilyev has information about its entrance. He, along with the Ghost, tries to get inside, but dies on the way from the swamps. His PDA, which Marked I finds next to Vasilyev's body, contains information about entering X-16 and also states that the scientist abandoned the Ghost. Having entered the laboratory, the Marked I turns off the pseudo-brain installation that generates psi radiation and again loses consciousness.
If this is so important, why didn't you explain what you are going there for? And where did you get this photo from?
If you only knew where I've just been and what I saw.
One day you'll finish badly, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Hold on, son.
Having come to his senses, Marked I finds the corpse of the Ghost. There is an entry in his PDA that says Vasilyev, instead of turning off the psi installation, escaped, and the Ghost planned to go to the cordon to look for the gunslinger. A mutual friend of the group, a stalker nicknamed Doctor, knows where to look for Gunslinger, and Guide knows where Doctor is, as he often visits the cordon. Ghost also has missing documents. Marked I gets out of the laboratory and takes these documents to the barkeep. The barkeep gives the Stalker a task: to infiltrate the X-10 laboratory and disable the brain scorcher. Then, the passage to the north will be open. Marked I finds Guide at the cordon and, saying that he's from Ghost, asks to be taken to Doctor. Guide reports that the Doctor wants to meet the man from the Ghost, but is afraid of surveillance. Therefore, he will wait for a meeting with Marked I in the cache of Gunslinger's group. They say that if the Marked I knows Ghost, then he will find the cache. Marked I goes to the Agropom dungeon, stumbles upon a previously unnoticed tripwire, and is knocked out. Having come to his senses, he sees the Doctor, who calls him the Gunslinger. Doctor explains to Marked I that he is the Gunslinger, and says that he came up with it and instructed him to install tripwires as a precaution. According to him, the legendary Wish Granter, Monolith, is just a hologram aimed from the bunker at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. None of those who reached it returned back. They must have died there. To get into the bunker, you need to take the decoder that opens the door in the sarcophagus, which is located in a cache in Pripyat. By this point, the overall picture of what had happened had almost formed. In the memories of Marked I, the player saw the consequences of Gunslinger's first trip to the center, the beginning of the second, and the formation of his group. The player is finally convinced that Marked I is the Gunslinger. People who went too far and got too close to the center of the zone, avoiding serious brain damage by the Rainbow Aggression Suppressor, had their memories partially erased and made them participants in the Stalker program. Participants in the program received the corresponding encoding in the form of a tattoo on the arm. That was the reason Gunslinger became Marked I. The person does not remember anything about the encoding and program past, about the zone, about what he saw in the laboratories, and even about his own name. He has only already acquired survival skills in the zone and motor skills, and only remembers his task, which is given to him by the C Consciousness group. The person does not understand why he must complete this task, but he tries his best to complete it. Only with time does his memory begin to return. From the character's memories, it becomes known that during the first raid to the center of the zone, Gunslinger was seriously wounded after a shootout with the monoliths. The Ghost and Fang were able to bring their friend to the doctor, where he cured the Gunslinger. After this, the Stalker went north again, but fell under the ejection and with difficulty returned to the doctor. Having recovered again, Gunslinger still planned to go to the center a second time. The doctor had no choice but to let Gunslinger go. This was the end of their previous meeting. After talking with the doctor, Marked One goes to the army warehouses where an armed conflict begins between Duty and fighters of the anarchic stalker group Freedom. Here, according to the plot, there are two options for the course of events. The first is to help Duty. Marked One kills the Freedom sniper on the tower. The Duty ones break through to the Freedom base and clear it. The second option is to help Freedom. Marked One tells Lukash from Freedom what happened and together with his squad, kills Duty members. The second option is more logical, since the Freedom group will continue to appear in the plot. Having passed the warehouses, Marked One comes to the barrier checkpoint and helps Freedom repel the attack of the Monolith group, which in its concept is similar to a religious sect that is settled in the center of the zone and does not allow anyone to approach it. It protects the approaches to the center of the zone. Having repelled the attack, Marked One goes to radar, penetrates the X-10 laboratory, and disables the Brain Scorcher installation. The news of the Scorcher's shutdown spreads throughout the zone at lightning speed. And Marked One, well, he loses consciousness again. Having come to his senses, Marked One tries to get to the surface while the laboratory is stormed by everyone who is not too lazy to spend some ammunition and shoot for the monolith. After shutting down the Scorcher, the military spends special forces to radar to capture and hold the antennas. The barkeep contacts Marked One and says that the breakthrough to the center of the zone has already begun. They say that if he hurries, he can go there with a detachment of veterans that are gathering near Pripyat. And while Duty and Freedom begin a new massacre for the unexplored territory behind the Scorcher, Marked One goes to Pripyat, where together with a detachment of veteran stalkers, he makes his way to the city center. If the player learns from the doctor about his past, he finds a cache in the hotel, Polisi, in room 26. It contains Gunslinger's report on his first campaign and a decoder that can open the secret door on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant sarcophagus. Marked One goes out to the stadium, behind which there is a direct road to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. At this moment, the real mess begins. The military begin the special Operation Monolith and storm the station from helicopters. The Marked One does not get involved in military disputes with the Monolith group. He simply moves towards the sarcophagus. At this moment, C Consciousness launches the release, but the main character manages to run into the station's premises before it starts. Operation Monolith ends in a catastrophic failure for the military. All equipment that ends up on the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant during the release is lost. Tanks and armored personnel carriers are hit by fire from the Monolith group, and 11 helicopters fall here and there, not allowing the crew to escape. Being on the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Marked One is faced with a high level of radiation. At one time, the reactor explosion is so powerful that the reactor cover weighing 450 tons flies into the air, punches a hole in the roof, and falls to the ground. In just a few minutes, a person receives hundreds of X-rays in this place. But besides radiation, the player encounters the military leading the assault on the station and fanatics from the Monolith squad. At the same time, the voice of the Monolith beckoning to him sounds in Marked One's head.
Путь завершен, человек. Иди ко мне.
Well, a madhouse, in a word. Here, the player can succumb to the Monolith's temptation and make a wish. Then he receives one of 5 false endings, depending on the player's statistics collected during the game. But we'll talk about them a little later. First, the real ones. Resisting the Monolith's temptation, Marked One finds a door with an electronic lock and opens it with a decoder. Behind it is the Wish Granter control bunker. By destroying 6 power units powering the installation, the Marked One causes a failure in the system. The malfunction causes a holographic image of a representative of C Consciousness to appear before the character. He answers Marked One's questions about who he is, what C Consciousness is, about experiments, and what good goals the scientists pursued. According to the representative, Gunslinger received the task of killing himself as a result of a mistake, and now he has the right to choose: joining the C consciousness group or destroying it. These are two real potential endings of the game. According to the representative, the zone is growing and it is becoming more and more difficult to contain it. But if the Marked One joins the C consciousness, they will become stronger and will be able to control it while they look for a solution to the problem. And if he destroys C consciousness, the energy of the new sphere will freely flow into the territory of the zone and cover everything around, and no one knows what this will lead to. You can, of course, join the scientists. But this ending is not canonical, since then Gunslinger disappears in the zone, and from the events of Stalker, Call of Pripyat in the future, it becomes known that Gunslinger survived and came to the military. So, the main character leaves the Chernobyl nuclear power plant building and seeks to destroy C consciousness. Scientists are making a last attempt to stop the Marked One and are preparing a new release. The Marked One eliminates the monolith fighters and, using the teleport anomaly on the roof of the sarcophagus, moves to the C consciousness bunker, where he sees all the participants in the process. He shoots the capsules of the C consciousness participants. At this moment, the player sees how the world is changing. The sun breaks through the clouds, and Marked One with a calm soul lies down to rest on the green lawn. This is the canonical ending of Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, which the developers adhered to in the continuation of the series. But we still wonder what the developers have come up with for the 5 false endings. So, in them, everything depends on game decisions, finances, or items in the player's hands. For example, the greedy ending is quite common. After all, getting it is one of the easiest. To do this, you need not to kill the leaders of the groups and accumulate more than 50,000 rubles. The Gunslinger will want more, and for his greed, he will be buried under a pile of metal. If the player kills the leaders of the freedom and duty groups, he will receive the ruler ending. The shooter will feel like the most important person in the zone and will want more, to become the main person on the entire planet. Well, the monolith will figure it out and simply take his soul. Another quite popular ending is immortality. This is due to the fact that many players carry character-enhancing and health-enhancing artifacts with them during their playthrough, and very often use medical kits. At the same time, it is enough just to save the life of one of the leaders of the groups, duty or freedom, and have less than 50,000 rubles on hand. Then Gunslinger asks Wish Granter for immortality and receives it, quite literally. Probably the most terrible ending of all can be called the disappearance of humanity. In it, Gunslinger makes a request to the monolith to destroy all of humanity because that is what he says it deserves. To achieve this negative ending, the player must behave like a real horseman of the apocalypse, bringing chaos. You need to ruin your reputation by killing ordinary stalkers, leave one of the group leaders alive, and have less than 50,000 rubles in your hands. It's difficult to say what exactly the monolith does with Gunslinger's wish, but apparently he's the first to be affected by his wish. Creepy visions of a nuclear apocalypse kill the character, and everything around him goes dark. And the last false ending is zone disappearance, or positive ending. If you don't kill anyone, but on the contrary become a friend of the stalkers, give them first aid kits and come to their rescue, leave the group leaders alive, and have less than 50,000 rubles, then Gunslinger will make the monolith such a cherished wish for everyone. I want the zone to disappear. The zone really disappears. But, as always, there is one thing. Obviously, all these desires are just the fruit of a sick imagination and the mind of the Marked One, subject to the influence of psi waves, and are not actually fulfilled. Truly, they cannot be fulfilled, since Wish Granter is not Santa Claus, but only an illusion, a psi installation with a hologram. Wish fulfillment actually means only one thing. The victim's mind is completely absorbed by the monolith, and now the victim sees everything he wants. Nevertheless, it's up to you to decide which ending of the game is best. Even Gunslinger, after destroying C consciousness, says, "I don't know if I did the right thing or not. I'll probably never know. But I made a choice. I hope it was the right one." Gunslinger. Write in the comments under the video what ending you had during the playthrough or what you think is the best in Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. Looking at the game from a gameplay perspective, it might seem hard to argue that Stalker is anything other than a first-person shooter. This is exactly what the developers were afraid of and tried very hard to move away from the shooter genre to the RPG genre, and the characteristic RPG features are definitely visible. For example, the main character's movement through the plot occurs from one location to another, where equally significant events take place in the background, and if desired, the player can take part of them as a side quest. And even though most of them boil down to run on errands, the developers tried to diversify the gameplay focused on shooting. The game has a leveling system through obtaining new and improved equipment, possible modifications of weapons, strengthening the character with artifacts, and even obtaining new ranks. Rank is the division of stalkers in accordance with their experience and knowledge in the zone. As a rule, it reflects not only the stalker's skills, but also his equipment. The ranks were supposed to reduce the recoil of the weapon when shooting, increase endurance when running, and possibly carry weight. But it is difficult to say how far this has been implemented. You need to earn experience points for completing quests and killing mutants or NPCs to increase the rank of the main character. It was a distinctive feature of RPGs. And another distinctive feature of RPGs is the presence of a dialogue system in the game, which seemed to imply much greater variability in the plot development in the game. And this was the case in Oblivion Lost. It was not an action game and leaned towards the RPG genre, but the American publisher THQ insisted on cutting down this concept. The fact is that the developers did not have enough experience and time to implement the role-playing component well, and in this case, shootouts with mutants and other opponents would look different. At best, like in Fallout 3. The headshot system, which is in Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, brought the player a guaranteed victory in a shootout, could be replaced with critical damage, which did not guarantee the enemy elimination. The full-fledged role-playing concept was abandoned. Thus leaving only some role-playing elements in the game, the developers turned Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl into a conditional immersive sim, and together with the A-Life simulation, achieving immersion, that is the effect of complete immersion in the game, when the properties of the interface and the technological part of the environment ensure the association of the player's own self with the environment and direct interaction with it, seemed not so difficult. The environment, atmosphere, and lore of the Stalker could easily entertain the player, both with pre-written plot scripts and the results of his life outside the character's field of vision. That is, once again, the life simulation in Stalker motivated the player to explore the world around him, observe the lives of the characters, search for rare artifacts, and thereby influence the story gameplay. The truth was not always successful, because for some reason the player had to be aware of the same hiding places in the zone before opening them. If the player did not learn about the cache from any character but found it accidentally, then the cache was empty. So the game often encouraged players to be aggressive and commit murder in order to obtain information about this or that hiding place. And during testing, there were possible situations when some NPC could complete your quest or take the item for the quest to another place. As a result, some planned functionality was abandoned due to technical limitations and lack of team experience. The game world is not entirely a single open space, since between some locations there are special passages through a short loading time, but despite this, all the inhabitants of all these locations live their own lives. And this is precisely what at one time distinguished Stalker from most open-world games. In the same GTA, the world is still open, but the generation of events occurs around the player in his field of vision. All NPCs go somewhere, do something, but all this does not affect the gameplay in any way. They appear in the field of view and disappear beyond it. In Bethesda's games and similar RPGs, the characters are even prescribed a daily cycle of movement, so it can't even be called a life simulation. After the developers had to cut down the life simulation system, the game lost some features in gameplay but did not become any more boring. This was mainly reflected in the generation of events. Significant incidents do not always happen exactly where the observer is located. You can calmly go through the entire game and never see how a bloodsucker kills bandits, or how a horde of jerboas defeat a heavily armed lone stalker. The changes to A-Life also affected the maintenance of the number of stalkers in the zone. If the player kills all the bandits at one of their bases, there is a high probability that new bandits will arrive there from outside the base. However, initially, the developers' plan using A-Life was much larger, and one might say, it was brilliant.
That's a great plan, Walter. That's ingenious, if I understand it correctly.
For example, it was assumed that dogs would attack the character only because of hunger if the player did not attack them, and you could fight them off simply by throwing away 1 or 2 sausages. In some ways, this mechanic remained. When overcoming checkpoints, the player could pay or bribe local military or bandits with vodka and canned food instead of killing them. Furthermore, NPCs had much more mobility. They more consistently captured safe places and fought for them more fiercely and could take on quests, which were also generated based on what was happening around them. Well, for example, if there were dogs somewhere, then the local barkeep of that location offered to exterminate those dogs, and not only the main character, but also any other suitable bot Yvonne could take on this task. But the most interesting thing was that non-player characters could even complete story quests, including the final one. Imagine the players' faces when they were walking somewhere in a radioactive wasteland, shooting at jerboas, and then bam, someone destroyed C consciousness. However, having tried to implement this, all the developers encountered many problems, ranging from the usual indignation and misunderstanding on the part of game testers, ending with performance drawdowns. Simulating the behavior of multiple AI objects in a large open world such as a non-passage-free zone placed a significant strain on the hardware at the time. To maintain game frame rates, the developers had to optimize and greatly simplify the A-Life system. This was beneficial both for players' understanding of what was happening and for the game itself, where the unpredictability of A-Life sometimes led to strange or game-breaking behavior from non-player characters. For example, non-player characters could wander into dangerous anomalies or initiate unrealistic combat actions, so the developers had to reduce the degree of unpredictability. GSC Game World has reduced features and aspects of the A-Life system, including some planned actions and interactions between NPCs, and has decided to reduce the scale of the game world. Along with the A-Life system, some interesting ideas started appearing in front of the developers. For example, at some point in Stalker Oblivion Lost, the map was larger and had 15 locations rather than the 10 or so that players ended up seeing. The locations were also twice as large. After all, at that moment there was a car in the game, and the developers seriously planned that the player would move between locations around the world by car. But this idea was abandoned, and so that the player did not run for several hours from mission to mission, the locations and distances between them were reduced. Among the cancelled locations were, for example, generators, or destroyed generators. This cut location from Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is only available in XR Core Build 1935 and was in development on October 18, 2004. By the way, during development, the project went through 128 different versions of the game build. But let's return to generators. The location was situated half a mile from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and consisted of special half-destroyed generators, thanks to which the zone appeared. The central part was occupied by a structure consisting of generator balls arranged in a circle and an antenna located in the center. The area was covered with dead forest and swamps. Not far from the installation, there was a military base with an underground passage to the outside. The territory was inhabited by various rare mutants. There were many anomalies around, and all this was well guarded by the monolith. The location also contained a small destroyed village in which there were many different living creatures and a high level of radiation, and in the air, one could hear the sounds made by the chimera. However, the mutant had already been cut out of the game at that time. As you may have guessed, before the game release, some mutants and monsters were cut out, such as zombies, chimeras, or rats, which were supposed to terribly annoy players with their quantity. Also, during the development of Stalker Oblivion Lost, the developers included in the development plan some bosses that were supposed to be present in a certain location and remembered by the player, but later they abandoned this idea. Among the cancelled bosses was the Master Buer, who was encountered in the X-18 laboratory and had the most powerful telekinetic ability in the zone. They were supposed to be worshipped by the dwarves, who were representing a separate species of mutants in the game. There was also the Mist Stalker, a jelly-like creature in a flask in a laboratory under Yantar, possessing outstanding psionic abilities that influenced the entire zone. Among the acidic puddles and the thick fog, this creature had to manipulate the mutant puppets taken under control: zombies, dogs, and people. This jelly-like entity would cast illusions on the player and try to confuse them in the corridors. As a result, this idea was reworked, and 5 years later appeared in Shadow of Chernobyl like a giant brain in the X-16 laboratory.
Emissions. Leave the area immediately.
Well, the player could meet the Black Stalker in the swamps, an imaginary enemy who appeared due to hallucinogenic fumes. He could have set traps on the player, closed doors on him, and attacked him, but this idea was abandoned. All that remained of Black Stalker was an anecdote about him in the game. The last boss in the game at the time of documentation development were Master of Consciousness, which was the oldest and gloomiest of all controllers, living in a nest of controllers in Pripyat, and the Invisible Entity, which was located on the last level in an abandoned laboratory under the generators and looked like a poltergeist hiding behind a dead human body. The Invisible Entity asked the player questions, and its madness depended on his answers. Feel those goosebumps? However, the most interesting creatures that disappeared before the game's release were cats. During the development of Stalker Oblivion Lost in 2003, as part of the game's PR campaign, GSC Game World decided to hold the Monster Ball contest, an international competition, the purpose of which was to give the game fans the opportunity to invent, describe in detail, and introduce their own mutant monster in the game. And the winner of this competition was Cat Bayun. Its peculiarity was his cunning hunting tactics. When the player walked past abandoned buildings and heard something vaguely reminiscent of a child crying inside, he went inside and it turned out that it was a cat. As a result, all that remained of the mutated predator in the game was a stuffed animal at the det base. But to be honest, Cat Bayun really didn't fit into the game. There was also an idea for stealth when the player could put on the outfit of a bandit and they would mistake the character for one of their own. But for some reason, the developers also abandoned it and never returned it, although the idea was simple and interesting. The idea of changing day and night in the game has not been fully implemented. This doesn't affect the gameplay at all, it just adds atmosphere, but at the same time, it's impossible to go to bed and wait somewhere more convenient for the quest. It would seem that this is logical, but the developers would implement this idea of changing day and night only in the next parts of the series. By the way, in the early versions of Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, the player had to walk around with a special detector and search of anomalous zones, and use it to calculate objects invisible to the naked eye. They were much less common, and because of that, they were more expensive. The idea was abandoned for some time, because in the next parts of the Stalker series, the developers returned to the idea of detectors, but more on that another time. During development and early builds of the game between mid-2004 and early 2006, significantly more music was played than on release. But even listing their performers would be a great sin. A bunch of Soviet hits that were supposed to play from street speakers and on the radio in the game. The only Ukrainian composition from the entire abundance of music that was cut out was Razom Nos Bahato. Together, We Are Many, by the Ukrainian band Green Jolly, which probably refers the player to the then recent revolutionary events in Ukraine in 2004 to 2005. Instead, the soundtrack, which was created in 2003, was recorded by Vladimir Muzi Frey. His compositions in dark ambient and noise styles, the ambient genre, were used in the game locations to create the gloomy atmosphere of abandonment inherent in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Also, the Ukrainian melodic death metal band S.T.A.L.K.E.R recorded several tracks specifically for the game. By the way, the lead singer of the group, Oleg Yavorsky, is also the PR manager of GSC Game World. On February 25, 2006, at the second GameLand Awards ceremony, S.T.A.L.K.E.R debuted their soundtrack with a live performance of Fighting Unknown. Another of their famous songs, Dirge for the Planet, is heard inside the game in the bunker of the merchant Sidorovich. Also in the game from Barkeep's Radio in the 100 Rads bar, the lyrical composition Gerza Dreaming, performed by the Ukrainian band Adaraya, is played. Initially, GSC Game World planned to release the game's soundtrack on CD and include it in the Collector's Game Edition, but a week before the release, on March 14, 2007, It was announced that for technical reasons this would not happen, and later it would be made publicly available for download. After 2 weeks, a collection of soundtracks became available for download on the game's official website. Initially, on the contrary, there should have been fewer endings in the game, but at some point the American publisher THQ told the developers that it would be good to add more alternative endings to the game. The result turned out well. At the same time, despite the long period of development of Shadow of Chernobyl, errors in the game to this day are simply a dime a dozen. Not everything has been fixed by the developers, and some could not be fixed even by the abundance of mods created by the game fans who, despite the bugs, loved it with all their hearts. It's surprising that the developers didn't leave many Easter eggs in the game for fans. The most obvious one is that the vodka is called Cossacks, referring the player to another GSC Game World game of the same name, which allowed developers to make Stalker for so long with peace of mind and made its release possible. In the X-18 lab, you can even see a photo of the happy development team hanging in the refrigerator room. At the same time, some phrases of the bandits are referred to prison slang, and for example, they quote the popular serial film The Meeting Place Cannot Be Changed in the post-Soviet space, where in one of the episodes, Sharapov uttered the catchphrase Pivpov i vdamki. In Stalker, it was slightly reworked and given to the bandits in the form of Ano chiki vriki vidanke. Also, the bandits sing Murka, and in the game, you can meet Freeman, who probably reminds the player of the main character of the Half-Life series. Like if you were waiting for a video about this legendary series of games. And we move on. Lore is perhaps the most interesting part of Shadow of Chernobyl and the entire Stalker series because the plot is based around it. I'd like to start with the characters, of which there are a whole lot in the game, and they are all beautiful in their own way. Starting from story characters, ending with monster-like creatures, ordinary stalkers, and their factions. Almost all mutants in Stalker, with the exception of wild boars and blind dogs, have their own unique character, behavioral characteristics, and habitat. Stalkers know of only one species of animal that does not pose a threat: the crow. Birds are probably not susceptible to psi radiation and have not been experimented on. It's a pity. Just imagine the potential these creatures have.
Yes, you're not dangerous at all, are you?
The influence of the zone incredibly accelerates the evolutionary adaptation of species. According to the game plot, mutants were formed within a matter of years, 1 or 2 generations. An equally important factor is genetic experiments, which are believed to have been carried out in several now abandoned laboratories in the zone. Simply put, mutants could be called any creatures living in the zone, with the exception of humans. Mutants that appeared under the influence of the environmental retained the external or genetic data of their ancestors. For example, in a blind dog, anyone can easily recognize it as a dog. The same situation is with boars, jerboas, rats, and crows. Outwardly, they have practically not changed. In turn, Flesh is a pig that has changed beyond recognition, but is still an ordinary pig. And the ancestor of the pseudo-dog is considered to be an ordinary wolf. By the way, pseudo-dog also has a relative, Psy-Dog, but it appears in the game less often than anyone else. Things are much more interesting with the comrades who appeared as a result of experiments. We have already talked about some of them earlier. The bloodsucker, Führer, controller, poltergeist, pseudo-giant, and chimera appeared as a result of secret experiments of the C Consciousness group. For example, Führer appeared as a result of experiments on the development of telekinetic abilities in humans, and controller, telepathic ones. Chimera and pseudo-giant were the results of crossing the DNA of humans and some animals. It's hard to say which ones when you see a pseudo-giant, a huge head on 2 legs. But the same poltergeists are not so easy to describe because often in the game they are invisible and all they do is fly around the player and annoy him with their telekinetic tricks. They are somewhat reminiscent of Casper's evil brothers.
Can you deal with that? Can you?
Poltergeists almost always live in dark in underground rooms, occasionally emerging from there. They hover above the ground, constantly flying around their territory, and essentially do nothing else. Poltergeists rarely meet with other representatives of the fauna of the zone, which is why if they find themselves in an open area, they will be at enmity with almost everyone. It attacks people from afar, lifting objects into the air and throwing or bringing them down directly on the person. And up close, it can appear blue-violet in color. Sometimes there are fire poltergeists. They create local pillars of flame when attacking. While moving, it makes a sound reminiscent of a device during a short circuit. They are also capable of laughing loudly and ominously, and when dying, they emit a long howl and become visible. It's strange why the developers abandoned the latter in subsequent parts of the game. We can safely say that poltergeists are the most harmless of this cohort of mutants. Controllers and bloodsuckers are much more dangerous and terrible creatures. Bloodsuckers are almost the main image of the entire Stalker series of games, the most recognizable of all the mutants in the game.
Shall we seal it in blood? Ink?
These are tall but hunched humanoid creatures with drooping tentacles on their chins. However, their distinctive feature is not this, but the ability to become invisible. It's not for nothing that stalkers in the game call the bloodsucker a hunter of hunters. They usually live and hunt in dark places, and even Buurs and pseudo-giants become victims of bloodsuckers. At the same time, they are quite aggressive and always attack first. Either they immediately become invisible and sneak towards their victim, or they first rush forward with a roar and become invisible at close range, and then rush around the victim, causing damage with their sharp claws. Mostly, bloodsuckers live alone, rarely forming any associations, but there are known cases of creating nests. In Stalker, Call of Pripyat, a nest of bloodsuckers can even be found on Zaton under the Circle Station. In the meantime, let's see who can compete with them in terms of horror and mortal danger. Controller. He's the most human-like of all the mutants. At the first glance, you may confuse him with your alcoholic neighbor Grisha. The same swollen face, and torn jeans and bandages after a street fight. However, in reality, when looking at his face, the mutant takes over the character's consciousness and uses telekinetic abilities to pull the person towards him, inflicting psionic blows. They cause dizziness, hallucination, and upon close contact, the controller hits the head so that the character drops their weapon. And sometimes the controllers do not disdain to keep the so-called retinue with them, consisting mainly of zombies, dogs, and snorks who serve them both as protection and food. By the way, the most inexplicable and mysterious organisms, the origin of study of which scientists are struggling unsuccessfully, are snorks. Are they the result of experiments, which would explain their presence in most laboratories and superhuman capabilities in the form of increased range and height of jumps, or are they simply feral zombies? Snorks are easily identified by the gas mask on their head and the characteristic somersaults after jumping, and they live mainly in dungeons. Yes, the zombies were once in the game, but by the time of release, the developers abandoned them, as well as the kink, either an experimental subject or simply a mutated person. Zombies and kinks had quite a lot in common. Besides, they were still people in the game who were not mutated, but zombified by psi radiation, and so that there would be no confusion, they were cut out. However, even with the absence of mutants on the horizon, the player should not relax. Besides mutants, another danger in the zone are people, military men, bandits, and representatives of warring factions. Their story is already more tied to the plot and locations in which they live, so we will touch on two topics at once. It's worth starting from the cordon, where the game begins, and the main character meets Sidorovich and ordinary stalkers, newbies living in the village on its way. From the very beginning of the game, the player can enjoy the wonderful atmosphere of a familiar identity in the form of buildings, signs, cars, sausage with vodka, and spiritual stalker gatherings around the fire with this. It is for this immersive atmosphere, stalker jokes, and guitar playing that many people love the game. When you walk from a difficult mission through a dangerous zone and see a safety island in the form of stalkers resting around a fire, you immediately feel pleasant and calm. And what can we say about the bandits, and those familiar to our ears?
Time to nail those faggots! Spread out quick! Stop herding like cattle! We're about to smoke them! They're getting on my nerves for real! What the? Just as I was grabbing a bite! Oh, damn it, now what?
Although the original language of the game in the year of its release was Russian and English, and Ukrainian was added to the game over time, the developers should express special gratitude for the voice acting of the bandits, because it is in the original voice acting that they sound the most colorful and canonical. The legendary voice of the Stalker series is Grigory Herman, who actually voiced the bandits and has also worked on dubbing films such as Transformers, Pirates of the Caribbean, and others. But no high-quality dubbing will give the game something that was not originally included in it. and a lot was included. Those anecdotes, nicknames of stalkers, names of artifacts, and locations greatly affected the player's immersion in the game. Next to the cordon is the border of the zone protected by the military. Next is the railway bridge, under which there is another checkpoint. And sandwiched between them is the auto transport enterprise, where bandits have settled. Further behind all this is the garbage, a typical cemetery of broken and non-working military equipment, fire engines, buses, and trucks, which probably participated in the liquidation of the accident at the station back in 1986. And in the center of the location, there are piles of garbage and anomalies. Here, a group of stalkers is holding their ground, and bandits are trying to attack them in every possible way. The garbage is an important transshipment point where you can find many useful artifacts and collect suitable equipment for further advancement into the zone. Moreover, the garbage is a crossroads. On the left is Agroprom Research Institute, on the right is Dark Valley, and ahead is the Wild Territory and Bar 100 Rads. Agroprom Research Institute is the first major location of the blockbuster movie level, where stalkers resist the military and the player sees a large-scale battle for the first time in the game. Well, after this, the player finds himself in a dungeon where the epic subsides again and the character is left to his own devices. And at this moment, the atmosphere takes over. All these mystical abandoned corridors with anomalies, mutants, and an ambient soundtrack. At the same time, the Dark Valley, which is a flat area with abandoned buildings and a farm, a gas station, two small swampy lakes, of which the central one is divided by a road bridge. In the north of the valley, there is an unfinished factory. In 2011, it was the base of the Freedom Group, but later the main base of bandits appeared on it, and access to the garbage has already begun to be controlled by Duty. The dungeons contain the secret X-18 laboratory with a lot of mysticism and evil spirits. As for the bar, it represents the second transit point where the character meets the local quest giver, Bartender. He is like an expansive Sidorovich. The bar is the most crowded and peaceful place in the game, which is also the main base of the Duty Group. Duty is a paramilitary group formed by former military personnel and volunteers. What remained of them was a charter, strict discipline, and a clear goal: protecting the world from the zone. The ideology of the group is based on protecting humanity from the dangers of the zone and its complete destruction. Duty is engaged in the destruction of mutants and bandit groups and also explores the zone and its inhabitants in order to fight them more effectively. The group's fighters are divided into military ranks. According to some stalkers and the Freedom Group, Duty is financed by the government because among them you can find former military personnel. Duty and the military pursue common goals: containment, study, and destruction of the zone. Due to this, Duty is in conflict with the Freedom Group, which are essentially anarchists. They believe that the zone needs to be preserved and peacefully coexist while exploring it. Other enemies of Duty are bandits, mercenaries, renegades, and Monolith. According to most stalkers, Duty is one of the strongest groups in the world. They often collaborate with hunters and are the only group that specifically exterminates mutants. The Duty people do not like to bargain, and they hand over all the artifacts that Duty representatives find during raids to scientists, receiving the necessary weapons and equipment from them. As for the bar location, next door you can also take part in a kind of gladiator battle, fights in the arena. Here, the conditions are dictated by the local organizer. He issues a certain weapon for battle, and the players find himself in a giant concrete warehouse where he must defeat the enemy with an identical weapon. There are several sparrings, and for each you can earn some money. However, if the player dies in the arena, he will be forced to continue the game from the last save. Well, further from the bar, most of the quests lead the character to the Wild Territory, which in essence is the western part of the abandoned Rostock plant. The area is a haven for various mutants, from jerboas and blind dogs to snorks and bloodsuckers. Anomalous activity is very high here, due to the technogenic nature of the landscape and high amount of abandoned buildings. The area is rich in artifacts of electrical, chemical, and thermal origin. The Wild Territory would be completely ignored by most stalkers if it weren't for its strategic placement. The shortest route from Bar to Lake Yantar, where the mobile laboratory of scientists is located, runs through the territory. This route is used not only by stalkers, but also by bandits and mercenaries. This is where the greatest activity of mercenaries is recorded. Mercenaries are a formation that performs tasks to order. These are mainly contract killings and searching for documents, but many members of the group also take on other work. The history of the group is shrouded in mystery. The mercenaries do not let you get close to them and kill everyone who gets in their way. Most stalkers know this very well and prefer not to contact. Stalkers understand that, if necessary, it is better to shoot to kill because if they don't kill, the others will kill them. Usually, no one has ever been able to find any personal items on the bodies of killed mercenaries. However, if the hero managed to kill the leader or even an entire squad of mercenaries, he can find a PDA on their bodies with various information. For example, about hiding places, and information is valued among traders. Mercenaries are neutral with bandits. Clear Sky, sometimes neutral with scientists, but hostile and dangerous with others, especially for lonely representatives who entered their territory. By the way, Clear Sky is not just the name of the future continuation in the Stalker series, but also a peaceful scientific group whose members are not fighters, but researchers who know how to use weapons. Clear Sky is a little-known group that lives in the swamps and studies the phenomena of the zone. No one knows for sure how many there are, what they do, and what goals they pursue. The main thing is that they do not try to sort things out with other factions, but only fight off renegades who interfere with their research. Next to the wild territory is Yantar, a scientific station built next to the lake of the same name, which studies the current situation in the zone, zombie radiation, and its source in the X-16 laboratory. This is one of the darkest locations, since the entire southern part of the valley is the hollow of a dried-up lake, and zombies with psi radiation roam around the territory of the abandoned plant and prevent scientists from conducting their research. But after turning off the psi installation, the passage to the brain scorcher opens for everyone. As we remember on the way to it, the main character faces a clear confrontation between duty and freedom, where the player can choose which side he is on in their conflict. On the side of the paramilitary and statutory duty, or on the side of the anarchists from freedom. In fact, the latter consists of free stalkers who want to resist the monopoly of the authorities. Their group is the largest in the zone, and besides duty, it openly resists the military and monolith. Relations with mercenaries are quite complex and sometimes hostile, but later, neutrality will be stated between them. Truly speaking, monolith can easily compete with freedom in terms of its quantity, but in ideological terms, it loses to both freedom and duty. Their main idea is based on a crystal, which they perceive as a local deity. The Monolith group worship it and read prayers, having assembled original models from garbage, which also serve as antenna transmitters, which can be seen at the side of their camp in Pripyat. They do not maintain relations with any of the groups, but at the same time they are neutral towards zombie stalkers, considering them converts, and they consider the rest of the stalkers to be unfaithful and subject to destruction. Well, what can I say? And it is these sectarians that the main character of Shadow of Chernobyl meets on the territory of the Brain Scorcher. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat are their main habitats. The only problem that the player encounters in Pripyat is that this location has been worked out from the atmosphere to the authentic rendering of real buildings and objects, but they do not allow you to enjoy the location. You could take tours around the virtually recreated Pripyat and S.T.A.L.K.E.R, but you literally have to run through it under machine gun fire from your opponents. However, later the developers slightly corrected the situation in the sequel. But at the same time, Chernobyl nuclear power plant is not so well developed. It is not always visible from the outside, and the pace of the plot events prevents you from admiring it. But inside the room is made in a rather uniform way. You can get the impression that the developers did not recreate this from a photo, but invented and imagined it, or were simply in a hurry to finish and release the game as quickly as possible. Or perhaps here the game focused more on action and story. S.T.A.L.K.E.R's concentration on action is almost its main problem because sometimes it greatly interferes with immersion. The developers have worked well on the weapons, of which there are a lot. Several types of pistols, several types of shotguns, the Viper 5 submachine gun, 2 types of Kalashnikov assault rifle, AC-96-2 Oblivion, Tundra S-14, Special Assault Rifle Avalanche, IL-86, TR-301, SGI-5K, GP-37 and FT-200M rifles with the ability to fire sub-caliber grenades, 4 types of sniper rifles, one of which is a Gauss rifle secretly developed by scientists, capable of killing anyone with one shot. Just get it and find batteries for it, and you are invincible. And the shooting from this weapon is well thought out. All weapons have their own recoil and their own types of suitable cartridges. Bullets fly according to the laws of ballistics, and not everyone hits exactly where the player aims. At the same time, you can install sights and other modifiers on weapons, and thanks to the A-Life system, all the previously listed opponents behave as if they are alive. They hide, talk to each other, set up ambushes, go around and squeeze from several sides, and sometimes chase or retreat. This makes the shootouts in the game very lively and strategically interesting. It is even possible to play stealth at some points in the game, since silencers on the barrels reduce the volume of fire and opponents are guided by noise and light. Therefore, by moving slowly without turning on a flashlight at night and without making noise, you can remain unnoticed. But there are still too many shootings in the game, as for a story about a zone limited on all sides, where no one outside is simply allowed in. Everyone is already dying from radiation, psi radiation, and mutants, and they are also fighting with each other. The military men are storming the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in order to die in a mass grave, and the duty group is conducting life and death battles in the arena. Logic leaves the game at these moments. What can we say about the canned food, sausage, and vodka that absolutely everyone eats in the zone? It's not clear where there are so many supplies, and if they are constantly replenished, then how? I hope they are not made from the local boars and flesh. The zone is a dangerous place also because it is completely overgrown with anomalies. What is it? In simple words, this is a small area in space with which physical processes either do not occur or occur in some completely outlandish way and pose a mortal danger to all living things. Gravitational distortions, pillars of fire, electrical vortices, or acid clouds. On the zone territory, they appear haphazardly and not everywhere. In some places, there are so many of them that a person literally cannot get through, and in other places, they occur very rarely. But not all anomalies stand still, and based on mobility, they can be divided into static and mobile. Yes, the vast majority of anomalies are static, but in the game, for example, there is a Tesla that moves strictly along a closed trajectory. Oops, sorry, that's not it. Also, Electro can be considered an isolated case of moving anomalies, which occasionally can move, as for example, in the dungeons of the Agroprom Research Institute. But not all anomalies cause physical or mental damage. There are also conditionally harmless ones like Teleport and Space Anomaly, both of which move a person in space without harm to health. Also considered conditionally harmless is the Lift Anomaly, which is a local area with zero gravity. The number and power of anomalies gradually increases from south to north of the zone. There are much fewer anomalies on Cordon than, for example, on Radar. In the game, anomalies are almost always subtle and do not catch your eye until you get close to them. Because of this, the player sometimes faces unexpected difficulties because getting around one anomaly that was not accidentally noticed is still half the trouble, but wandering into a whole cluster of similar ones can lead to inevitable death. It would seem that you are on your way, everything is fine by the standards of a stalker's life, but now you are throwing bolts in all four directions to pave a safe path for yourself. This is how Sidorovich instructs Marked 1 in the game. Be careful, you're close to anomalies. Use the bolts to define their boundaries. Sidorovich. And in fact, this mechanic was very fresh for games of that time. The easiest and most effective way to detect an anomaly and mark its boundaries is by throwing bolts. Of course, there are also sensors in the game that indicate the presence of an anomaly nearby with a sound signal. And in future parts of the Stalker series, anomalies can even be seen on the detector. But in the absence of something like that, you throw a bolt at the anomaly and you can pass through, or you can see where to bypass it. Some anomalies can be detected visually. Burner, Brute Punch, Electro are clearly visible at any time of the day. Gravity anomalies can be identified by air trembling, leaves, or debris flying around. Many anomalies have so-called post effects. This is when visual disturbances are observed in the immediate vicinity of the anomaly. Colorization of the image, change in its brightness, ripples, noise. Yes, some anomalies produce characteristic sounds, not only at rest, but also when they enter the area of influence of foreign objects. In this case, the sounds are usually much louder and can be heard over a greater distance. If we draw a parallel with the novel Roadside Picnic, then the zone there also looked like a rather abandoned area, but there the anomalies were of a more subtle and implicit nature. Gravitational distortions were not visible there at all and had to be checked with bolts. And besides this, completely outlandish things were encountered. The shadow of objects could fall towards the sun and not from it behind the object, and the shadow did not pose a threat to a person. It could not fry you, dissolve you, throw you up, or shock you, but purely instinctively when faced with something like this, the reader felt fear or apprehension. In the game, though, there was nothing scary left exactly at the moment when the player understood how the anomaly behaved and what to do about it. Only mysticism remained, primarily related to the fact that most anomalies are capable of generating artifacts. The mechanism of this phenomenon is not known, but most often it is the result of the interaction of the anomaly with various objects, for example, the remains of animals and plants caught in the anomaly or metal debris. Anomalies of a certain type generate certain artifacts with characteristic properties, and in this regard, in S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl, the idea was implemented much more interestingly than in Roadside Picnic. What effect the artifacts have and why is completely unclear. Each of the several dozen artifacts in the game has its own characteristics and features. These characteristics can have both positive and negative effects on the person. For example, a player can gain 200% increased health by increasing their susceptibility to hits, shots, and lacerations by 10%. Some increase endurance, some increase resistance to radiation, some increase resistance to chemical burns, and so on. And the rarer the artifact, the more positive and stronger its properties, and therefore the cost of such an artifact from local traders will be higher. The player always has the opportunity to either wear an artifact on his belt, just remember that space for them is limited, or sell it to the first person he meets, and often there is a need to make a dramatic choice, to sell an interesting find, or to keep it for yourself. Fortunately, in Shadow of Chernobyl there are so many artifacts in the zone that some, like the jellyfish artifact by the middle of the game, can form a pack of 10 or more pieces, so the player, in order to lighten his weight, naturally begins to throw them at his feet. The rarest and most useful artifact in the game are the shell, which gives 30% resistance to burns, the pellicle, which gives 30% resistance to chemical burns, the spring, which provides 30% resistance to shock, and the electro battery, which gives 30% resistance to electric shock. By the way, when pushed, it makes an expressive metallic roar. You also cannot do without the Moonlight artifact, which adds 109 to your overall stamina and allows you to carry a little more weight beyond the maximum or not run out of breath longer when running. The Mica artifact will provide 400% resistance against bleeding, and the Soul will provide an additional 600% to health. Artifacts Crystal Thorn, or Crystal, help to cope with radiation best, reducing its impact by 30%, but both they and the previously named Moonlight, Mica, and Soul have several disadvantages that can lead to undesirable consequences. So, you should choose artifacts carefully, and better think ahead about your future playstyle. Now it seems we have talked through all the main points that relate to the game. The only thing that has not yet been touched upon is the game release, which also did not go smoothly. Let's talk about this. March 20th, 2007, S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl is officially released after 7 long years of anticipation from fans. Millions of Roadside Picnic fans and gamers of all ages are running to the store for what may be their first licensed game. In anticipation of the first launch, they bring the game home, begin installation, and get a cookie. Because at the time of release, the game had a bunch of incompatibility problems and simply did not run on many computers. After the release, S.T.A.L.K.E.R received favorable reviews from reviewers and gaming magazines with an average score of 83% in game rankings. However, while some praised the game for its style, depth, and atmosphere, other reviewers described certain technical problems, mentioning the number of bugs in Shadow of Chernobyl. Due to the previously mentioned number of bugs in folk art, Stalker turned into Bug-Alker. The game behaved as unpredictable as the zone could once behave during development in relation to a stalker wandering through it. There were constant crashes out of the blue, non-working saves of the already completed game process, the disappearance of quest items and corpses of characters, and missions could become attached for life to these already dead characters with whom you can't even talk to. And after 6 global patches, some bugs can still be found in the game to this day. A whole lot of mods were released for the game as it was actively susceptible to adding third-party files, starting from closing known holes in the game code, ending with visual improvements to the environment and all sorts of gags. By the way, the game also has a multiplayer mode. It is accessible via a local network and the internet. The server supports up to 32 players, and players have 3 game modes: free-for-all, team play, and artifact hunt. The multiplayer game has a ranking system and 2 teams compete: the Freedom Group and the Mercenaries. And for the release of Shadows of Chernobyl, GSC Game World and the publisher THQ, exclusively for advertising purposes and to promote the main game, released a version of S.T.A.L.K.E.R from mobile phones on the Java platform Micro Edition. The result of their work was Stalker Mobile, which was a fairly simple phone shooter for half an hour of playing time with the background of the main game. Nothing special, but in theory it could compete with Gravity Defied, which was popular at the time. It's hard to say whether the app helped sales, or the fact that thanks to numerous stories from the developers about what a mind-blowing game they were making, everyone was looking forward to this project. But Stalker was a success. The project had a couple of dozen nominations and about a dozen awards, including, for example, Best Action Game of the Year at the PC Gamer Awards 2007. Based on the rating of the British organization ELSPA on March 24, 2007, Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl took 8th position in the sales chart for various platforms and first among games on the PC. A year later, it broke through the figure of over 1.5 million copies sold. The game sold 950,000 copies in the CIS and 700,000 copies in the West. Thanks to the American publisher THQ, the game is known and loved by a huge number of fans in the West. At the same time, it is impossible to calculate how many copies were brazenly stolen after the game was leaked online in its homeland. This number is probably 10 times higher than the number of official sales. Still, buying licensed games in the mid-2000s in the post-Soviet space was not held in high esteem and was not considered the norm. In those years, the norm was to pirate. Today, we condemn this matter. Nowadays, it is believed that Stalker series is a permanent exclusive for PC. However, throughout the existence of the franchise, GSC Game World has repeatedly made attempts to release games in the series on other gaming platforms. For example, in 2001 to 2002, during the development of Oblivion Lost, and later Stalker Oblivion Lost, some gaming publications stated that GSC was preparing to release the game not only for Windows, but also for the Xbox game console. At certain stages of development, the studio even had plans for porting to other platforms, but due to general busyness and difficulties encountered with production, they were shelved. Then in 2007, GSC was considering releasing Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl on the Xbox 360, as indicated by leaked design documents for the game. On November 23, 2007, GSC Game World announced that the studio had been certified by Microsoft as an official software developer for the Xbox 360 platform. Soon, the first attempts were made to port the X-Ray engine to the game console, but there was a shortage of manpower, and busy work on the add-on Stalker Clear Sky led to the fact that the release of Shadow of Chernobyl for Xbox 360 was cancelled. And the addition soon became a separate game project, the announcement of which took place on July 11th of that year. Also in mid-2006, a small team within GSC Game World began developing a standalone game in the Stalker series for the PlayStation Portable console from Sony. The first location with the working title Factory was modeled, design documents with concept art were written, and a technology demo version was created on PC. But by the beginning of 2007, development was stopped, all for the same reason. Due to the low priority of the project, the busyness of the developers with Clear Sky, and the lack of necessary specialists. Later, talk about the release of this game or that game on this or that console resurfaced in various interviews. And Serhiy Gergerovich boasted that some developments were already ready, that some were launched on the Xbox 360, others on the PlayStation Portable, but all this led to nothing. After all, fans of the Stalker series were waiting for a full-fledged second part of the game, Clear Sky. We'll talk about it in the next video in this series. Thank you for watching this video to the end. No matter how long it was, we hope you enjoyed it, and if you appreciate the work we did during its preparation, like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are more videos to come, but that's all for today. You've watched PressX. Go your way, Stalker.